Hello there. So you know how mappers have sort of identities based on what kinds of music they map? At one point, I was known for mapping English rock, Strategus and Secret Pipe are known for mapping standard drum and bass, Mazarin is the go-to guy for ear violation, and in the same vein, Grumd is the original Mr. Breakcore. His ranked maps library shows he's been at it since its beginning, and choices seen throughout his maps taught me a fair bit of how to organize my own. Before getting too ahead of myself, this is the music I'm calling breakcore. While obviously not applicable to every song in the genre, most breakcore songs in Osu have this type of inconsistent syncopated drum beat. When translated into mapping, that leads to complex rhythms involving tons of irregular 1/4 and 1/8 snapping, which is fairly special compared to other genres. Grumd popularized breakcore in Osu through his consistent release of standout maps in 2012. It's likely just because these maps are relatively old, but a general thing that appeals to me about these first breakcore maps is the balance of rhythm and spacing. They aren't about mega jumps or long spaced streams, but rather short bursts of variable 1/4 rhythms that kill player stamina to fit their song's intensities. It's a shift that makes these maps left-hand killers rather than right-hand aim game maps, which is especially appropriate for songs of this genre. On the micro scale, I also find myself thinking a lot about 1/8 sliders when looking at Grumd's maps. These are part of what make breakcore maps iconic in my eyes, since few other songs even support them, and being generally less used in mapping means it's easy to mess them up. Number of repeats. It's a worthwhile thing to keep in mind if you want players to reasonably interpret rhythm through more than just approach circles. Unlike normal sliders, you can't see how long you're supposed to hold these, so other patterns can be used to get across that information. First is the most obvious tactic, literally just using the same number of repeats on each slider. On the map, The Nature of Dying, for example, there's this slider of ambiguous length followed by a stream. Players will naturally want to click on a strong white or red tick next because that's what songs emphasize, yet in actuality, circle 6 is on a blue tick. Is this confusing? Misleading? Not really, because every slider before this in the section had the same number of repeats. It would be more confusing to click on the strong white tick here because players wouldn't be expecting a slider of a different hold length. Of course, this is mainly dependent on a song. Within a section of music, it feels natural to repeat a rhythm because songs usually repeat themselves, making this pattern more practical. In another one of Grumd's maps, Paver Nocturnus, there's a section that supports 1/8 sliders of different hold lengths, so Grumd shows the difference with 2 distinct object arrangements. After each multi-repeat slider, there's an overlap with the next object, whereas after each single repeat slider, there's a gap. This works pretty well because spacing is a clear differentiator, sure, but also because of expected cursor momentum. You don't really pause your cursor on these single reverse sliders, making high spacing feel natural, whereas you do pause on longer sliders, making small spacing effective. Rhythm. And just put the sliders on the 1/8 ticks with the music, easy peasy. You might think that's all there is to this breakcore rhythm, but there's a few other ideas to consider if you're not experienced with rhythm choice. Like, for one, a lot of Grumd's maps use this 3 repeat slider between white and red ticks, followed by streams. Given white ticks are usually stronger sounds in these situations, this seems like it would be unintuitive, but it's actually fine because of how players are accustomed to handling half-beat sliders already. A common technique is using the tail of a slider as the start of a stream because, for single tapping players, the blue tick is where they'd normally click their secondary finger. For half-beat long short repeating sliders, the same thing carries over, though not necessarily for sliders lasting a longer time. These feel like non-continuous things. Rhythm has been reset by the time you reach a stream, so it's more natural to start streams from the respective strong beats. In all of Grumd's maps, this is the logic behind multi-repeat 1/8 sliders. So this, acceptable. This, ew. While it's okay to start streams after slider ends, the same doesn't really apply to reverse sliders after slider ends. These give full emphasis to the beat being clicked, and if that's a 1/8 tick with a musically less important sound, it comes off as feeling really weird in gameplay. Like everything, there are exceptions, as seen in a couple of Grumd's maps, but 99% of the time, this is gross. Something else you may have noticed by now, 1/8 sliders on Grumd's maps almost always have 1/4 gaps after them, even when there's another sound in between. This is mainly done to make sure there are no unfair combo breaks caused by moving away from the slider too early. That being, it's a technique most effectively used with spacing and BPM in mind. If you've got a fast map with a 1/8 slider right next to the upcoming object, the gap won't really make a difference, whereas if the next object is far away, it might be a good idea to cut it off early. And another thing is, there's also... Is this really all that's interesting about Grumd's breakcore maps? I said he influenced how I organize some of my maps, but through some tips on 1/8 sliders? No. His maps and a lot of other people's impacts on my mapping aren't always definable by their most outstanding elements. I was a newborn on Osu at one point, like everyone else, and grumd's map of Gorge Hits Over the Flood was one of my favorites. It was the kind of map I could barely pass at first and would play practically every time I opened Osu. Looking at it now, there's a lot I could say about what makes it solid. It has that rhythm versus spacing control I talked about earlier, focused on making players decipher and execute fancy breakcore rhythms. There's about 2 minutes of really low spacing, then tension ramps up in the ki, where rhythm gets even more difficult through separated doubles and spacing necessitates proper aim. Even without having any slider velocity changes, this is the contrast I wish more maps today had, and it was aided by the minimalist storyboard perfectly setting the mood. This is one of the maps that has passed the test of time, still being remembered by the masses 6 years later. As an Osu player turning mapper at the time though, I wasn't actually taking that or anything else that made the map high quality into account. I was instead focused on parts of it which, for the sake of making a good map, weren't positive or negative in any way. Specifically, I remember sitting in the editor, staring at this intro section of the map, absorbing a few of its core visual elements that ended up defining my early mapping. The most obvious of these would be spacing between overlapped objects. For grumd, this was just a matter of following distance snap. Basically, the whole map has half-beat rhythm space with 1 times ds, while 1/4 rhythms are 0.5 times ds, the latter of which resulted in this amount of overlap. This was burned into my mind as a new mapper and became a habit I struggled to break. Standards for spacing were different when I was starting to map, so I didn't use this overlap for only 1/4 rhythms, but instead for just anything that overlapped. If 2 objects in my map were on top of each other, they weren't going to get stacked, they were almost certainly spaced this far apart. Yeah, every single map. Each example you're seeing here is from one of my old ranked maps, and I'm not cherry picking, I'm literally just going up my list of ranked maps. Starting from injection, I went through 36 maps that used the same amount of overlap. I didn't even realize I was this retarded until investigating for this video. Though, I guess it only feels weird because this isn't an idea that every mapper uses. If I said 36 of my maps had stacks or slightly angled straight sliders, most other mappers would be like, yeah, me too. At least the timeline here makes sense. The map where I stopped doing this overlap thing was from 2 years ago, which is when my map values took a complete 180. I have more clear ideas when mapping now than just doing what feels natural, but still, this amount of overlap is my mental default. Other habits I picked up from Over the Flood didn't last nearly as long. Controlled chaos is an idea I've found interesting in all mediums, and for mapping, alternating between these 3 slider shape types evoked that feeling. Just about all my old maps did this, yet when I broke the habit years ago, I hadn't even tried going back to it. Now, all of my slider shapes have some sort of pattern controlling them, and unlike those overlaps, I don't naturally err towards alternating slider shapes anymore. The last thing I picked up from this map was literally a slider shape that I was obsessed with. It showed up everywhere in my maps, enhancing the controlled chaos thing by not being perfectly centered. It was even memorable enough to be worth mentioning to grumd when he spoke at one point. I told him how silly it was that one of his slider shapes affected all of my early maps, and he replied stating that he took the idea from someone else too. And that got me thinking, chances are every mapper in their first stages of learning goes through a similar experience as I did with this Gorge Hit map. We play maps we enjoy, and rather than absorbing their most standout ideas, we adopt tiny things like an overlap or a slider shape. They seem like insignificant aspects, but to the new mappers absorbing and implementing the ideas, they become significant. What's weirdest to think about though is how this could have happened to me with any other map. If grumd's Paver Nocturnus wasn't in the 2013 World Cup map pool, which was my entire maps library at the time, I wouldn't have searched for more breakcore maps and found Over the Flood. And even with this map around, I easily could have adopted ideas from another map since the ones I took from this one weren't especially unique. Without grumd's breakcore maps, the majority of my ranked maps would be designed in ways I can't possibly picture, and I find that interesting to think about. So, yeah, misleading title, but I knew I'd be talking about grumd when reading breakcore anyway, so is it really misleading? It is. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.